Hello and welcome to another quickish video aiming to get you the very top grades. With Gerald it is incredibly easy because there's so much to argue about, and as soon as you start talking about more than one interpretation you're automatically moving into grade 7 and above. So we're going to start with the conventional view of Gerald that he's actually not too bad. As the inspector says, he at least had some affection for her, meaning Eva, and made her happy for a time. So Gerald gets off quite lightly from the inspector's blame. But we're going to look at Gerald's role in socially conditioning Sheila and women. Then we're going to look at this idea of sophistry, the idea of being able to argue something you don't believe in, but because you argue it so well, it sounds true. So he's actually incredibly deceitful. We're going to look at all the reasons the girl in the photograph must have been Eva, and we're going to use Gerald's own words to prove it, even though he's the one who suggests that they're not the same girl. Then we're going to look at the apparent grief that he shows for Eva's death, which is fake. And then finally we're going to look at how he represents the capitalist sexual exploitation of women in a patriarchal society. And you will understand all of that over the next 12 minutes. So the inspector isn't particularly critical of Gerald, and that sounds like Priestley isn't. Now this is possibly, I've written he himself, I mean Priestley himself was openly unfaithful in his marriage, and so he didn't disapprove of Gerald having an affair. You know, having sex outside marriage was not a big deal to Priestley. He believed that that was the right way to behave. So that explains why the inspector is reasonably complimentary of Gerald, because he represents Priestley's views. But something deeper is going on here. So now let's look at Sheila's words. And so she says to Gerald, "And now at least you've been honest, and I believe what you told us about the way you helped her at first, just out of pity." So it seems that Sheila, who is also the voice of the inspector and also therefore the voice of Priestley, is also forgiving of Gerald, therefore we shouldn't be too critical of him. But I think Priestley also invites our moral outrage about this. Sheila, in this quotation, is prepared to accept this honesty because the patriarchal society, that means a society ruled by men in the interests of men, has conditioned her to accept infidelity, that is, having affairs, conditioned her to accept infidelity in return for the financial security and social status of marriage. So rich women from powerful families are still treated as, in some ways, objects that their husbands possess. And the trade-off for these women is, well, it's better to be the object of a rich husband who you can at least influence than it is to be the property of your father and your parents. And this is the position that Sheila has, and to a bigger extent Eva has. They will accept quite appalling behaviour from men because it's better than the alternative. And I think Priestley is actually morally outraged at this. So when the inspector seems to forgive Gerald a little bit, that's giving society's view about his behaviour towards Eva, but actually he's very, very disgusted about the way that Gerald lies about his affair. And I'll show you what I mean now. So this word sophistry, remember, was being able to argue something that you know is untrue, but to do it in such a brilliant way that it sounds true. And we see Gerald's deceptions as a form of sophistry. So when he first meets Eva, he gets her drunk before he feeds her. Now he can clearly see that she's down on her luck and therefore considering prostitution and therefore short of money, and obviously she's going to be hungry in order to make this, for her, terrible decision to start looking for male company in exchange for money. But Gerald exploits that. He takes her off and pretends to care for her, or cares for her a little bit, but he makes sure he gets her drunk first, because this will make her more suggestible. She then tells him so many details which match exactly what the Birlings already know about her. But once the inspector's gone, he still pretends that they're all different girls. And the reason he does that is to say, well, if we all did something to different girls, doesn't really matter. And obviously Eric and Sheila don't accept that. The inspector wouldn't accept that, although he's not on stage. Priestley wouldn't accept that. He wants us to be really critical of Gerald's sophisticated argument that it doesn't really matter, because of course it does. So quite apart from her appearance, which is brown-haired, brown-eyed, attractive and young, all these things also exactly match what we know from the Birlings and what Eva told Gerald. So that she'd lost both parents, that she came originally from somewhere outside Bromley in the countryside, that she'd had a job in one of the works here, and that she'd had to leave after a strike, and she said something about the shop too. Now I've put the because that is mill words, not a shop, the exact shop. So it would be an extraordinary coincidence, wouldn't it? Far beyond what we'd be expected to believe, that this girl was in fact made up of loads of different girls, when everything about her fits exactly what everybody else knows. So Gerald's suggestion that it could be different photos of different girls is sophistry. Yes, in theory that could be possible, but in actual fact, no. The probability is just too great. Now let's go back to his words, or the inspector's words, that say Gerald treated Eva with some kindness. Well, in some ways he did, but he said he never meant to have a mistress and he never meant to have an affair. But let's look at the evidence. He installs her in a flat which is lent to him by his friend. And look at his words. It happened that a friend of mine had gone off to Canada for 6 months and had let me have the key of a nice little set of rooms. Now look at the word nice here, as in, I could put that to some nice use. It would be really convenient. Well, what for? Gerald's got somewhere to live. Well, obviously, in order to have a sexual adventure, in order to install a woman there, rent-free at very little cost, and have her available whenever he wanted her. So now we can see that these rooms are actually all about sexual exploitation. So let's consider a different meeting with Eva in the Palace Bar, where he'd decided that actually he was going to pay for sex. Well, every time he wanted sex, he'd then have to pay for it. Compare that to the nice little set of rooms where he can install her for nothing, for free. It doesn't cost him a thing, and he persuades her that he's making this grand gesture to help her out. Obviously she's grateful, and then he can have sex with her when he wants, and not make it seem like a grubby monetary exchange. But of course it is a grubby monetary exchange, because as soon as his friend comes back from Canada, he doesn't pay for her to go to another apartment. Oh no, he just boots her out. He does it in a way that makes him feel less bad about himself. So he says he'd given her an allowance, which is obviously less than he'd have to pay at the Palace Bar, and she'd lived very economically in what I'd allowed her. So she'd saved. Why was she saving? Well, she knew that she was being sexually exploited. She knew this relationship wouldn't last. She knew what Gerald was up to, and therefore she had to save money for when the affair would end. Even with this and his parting gift to her, she can only fund 2 months' stay in a bed and breakfast at the seaside, and then all her money runs out. This is much less than he would have had to have paid to rent a flat in Bromley to put her up in. Now, Priestley does this to symbolise how Gerald is like all upper-class men. Not just that they're happy to pay for sex, but also that they see any relationship as a way for them to exploit women in economic ways. So even a wife, Sheila, is going to be exploited in the same way. She will have to put up with his infidelities, his having affairs. She will have to put up with his way of treating her in some ways as a possession, because that's all that society allows. And Priestley's enraged about this self-justification where Gerald can say that actually he's an honourable human being and that he's doing it out of affection and care, when obviously he isn't. He's premeditated this, and he's just kicked her out as soon as it's become inconvenient to pay for her in any meaningful way. Now, he makes a great show of his emotions when he goes out. He says to the inspector, "Do you not mind if I leave, as I seem to have been affected far more by this. You know, I've only just taken in that Eva's dead." Well, the inspector lets him go, but what does he do? Well, he says that he found a sergeant that he knew. Well, this is complete rubbish. Sergeants didn't go out pounding the beat. They would stay at the station, at the police station. So what's Gerald obviously done? He's actually gone straight to a police station and to speak to a sergeant to find out if the inspector is real. He suspects all along that the inspector isn't real because of how rude the inspector was to him. And he's used to being treated as a man of status coming from an upper-class family. So he pretends to be upset by the death in order to prove that the inspector isn't real and to expose him, and therefore to claim that what they did to Eva didn't make any difference because it's not a real inspector. Well, obviously, as Sheila points out, it doesn't matter that he wasn't a real inspector, and even Eric says he inspected us all right, meaning that it doesn't matter that he wasn't a real inspector. We all did what we did. But Gerald wants to pretend that what they did to Eva has no consequence if the inspector is not real. There's a word for that, hopefully you remember it. There it is, it's sophistry, presenting something as though it's true when you know it's not. So why is Priestley potentially so angry with Gerald? Well, I'm going to argue that he is a much greater symbol of capitalism than the Birlings. Gerald, if you think about it, is the real face of capitalism in 1945, because in 1912, when the play takes place, and he's over 30 years old, he's going to be old enough to escape the First World War in 1914. He's not going to be made to enlist. And also, he's probably going to be used for the war effort running his father's textile company, Cross Limited. So he will be needed at home to make sure that all these soldiers have their uniforms. That will be the business. So obviously he'll be able to show he's supporting the war effort, and also he'll be able to show that he's a bit old to be going off to fight. So he is the exact kind of capitalist who has exploited the country between the two world wars. An awful lot of businesses became incredibly rich off the back of the war. Gerald's business would have been one of them, along with the Birlings. But here's the key thing. He would still be running that business during the Second World War. So he is the kind of capitalist who is profiting from both world wars. Whereas the Birling parents and the Croft parents certainly won't be running the business and are probably dead by 1945. So the capitalism that Priestley is attacking in the play is Gerald. And Gerald is the person who says one thing but actually believes something else. He is the person who Priestley wants us to reject. And he is therefore the symbol of the kind of capitalists who've made a profit out of the blood of young men. That is the fire and blood and anguish that the inspector was talking about. So this is quite a difficult argument, but I hope you've managed to follow it. Although the inspector doesn't seem to blame Gerald, once the inspector goes, Gerald's next actions show Priestley's real view that we are socially conditioned to accept this kind of appalling behaviour from upper-class men, but actually the way they justify it is a form of sophistry. He proves that by making Gerald himself describe so many details about Eva to prove that they must be the same girl. He lets us know that there was a huge element of premeditation in him taking on this flat and therefore installing a woman in it in order to sexually exploit her. He draws this parallel between the way Eva is exploited and the way upper class men exploit their own wives. We then see how dishonest he is about his grief at Eva's death, and he has in fact gone out to try and prove that the inspector is not real, because Priestley's point is it doesn't matter whether the inspector was real or not, it matters what they did, and the person who has been doing that all the way since 1912 till 1945 in the play, in the world of the play, will be Gerald, not the Birlings and not Gerald's parents, the Crofts. So Gerald is the true villain of the play. He is the capitalist that Priestley wants the audience to reject when they vote for a socialist government in 1945. So hopefully you can now nail that grade 7 or 8 or 9. Thank you very much for watching and subscribing. See you soon on my channel.